"You didn't even try," she said, her voice tight with hurt. "You could have saved her, but you didn't even try." Ron Harding is a middle-aged man who has spent over 12 years of marriage with Tracy, the wife he once loved wholeheartedly. He is a loyal husband, committed to building a happy and stable family. However, beneath his strong and composed exterior, Ron is a deeply emotional person and very easy to hurt. As a responsible man, he always places his family above all else, believing that love and loyalty will sustain his relationship. Ron Harding sat in the corner booth of the bustling downtown bistro, the comforting hum of casual chatter and clinking silverware masking the storm brewing inside him. It was a typical Wednesday evening, yet for Ron, everything felt on the verge of implosion. His fingers drummed rhythmically against the cold marble tabletop, a habit born from years of masking unease. Tonight was supposed to be a surprise, a spontaneous visit to the restaurant where his wife Tracy often met her friends after work. He had planned to sweep her off her feet with an impromptu dinner, a small gesture to rekindle the spark they had built over 12 years of marriage. What he hadn't planned for was the sight that now froze him in place, his throat tightening as if a steel hand had gripped it. There, across the room, Tracy sat in the glow of flickering candlelight. She wasn't alone. Beside her, leaning in with a familiarity that sent alarm bells ringing in Ron's head, was Kate, her longtime friend. The two were laughing, their heads close enough to whisper secrets that felt too intimate for a simple friendship. At first, Ron tried to rationalize it. Kate had always been Tracy's confidant, her shoulder to lean on during hard times. But as Tracy's hand slid across the table, intertwining with Kate's, the truth struck like a freight train. This wasn't platonic. This wasn't innocent. Ron's stomach churned as he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to look away, to leave before the fragile image of his marriage shattered completely. But his feet refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, a helpless witness to his own nightmare unfolding in real time. The vibrant world around him seemed to dim, leaving only Tracy's face illuminated, her smile a dagger twisted deep into his chest. As if sensing his gaze, Tracy looked up, her laughter dying mid-sentence. Her eyes widened, her face draining of color as she locked eyes with Ron. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The bustling restaurant faded into the background, replaced by a suffocating silence that only the three of them seemed to inhabit. "Ron?" Tracy's voice trembled, barely audible over the cacophony of the restaurant. She pulled her hand back from Kate's, as if the sudden distance could erase what Ron had just seen. This isn't what it looks like." Ron rose slowly, the scrape of his chair against the floor cutting through the air like a gunshot. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the searing betrayal etched into Tracy's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he even begin to articulate the devastation tearing through him like a hurricane? Tracy stood abruptly, her chair nearly tipping over. "Ron, please," she said, stepping toward him, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Let me explain." He held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Explain?" The word came out harsher than he intended, his voice raw with disbelief. "What exactly are you going to explain, Tracy? That holding hands in a candlelit restaurant with Kate is some kind of, misunderstanding?" Kate, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She opened her mouth to speak, but quickly shut it again, as though realizing nothing she could say would diffuse the situation. Her presence only amplified Ron's anger, the betrayal compounded by the fact that this wasn't just some stranger, It was someone Tracy had introduced into their lives, someone he had trusted. Tracy's face crumpled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Ron, I swear, it's not what you think," she pleaded. But then, as if the weight of the deception was too much to carry any longer, she exhaled deeply and said the words that would haunt Ron for years to come. "I still love you, but this thing with Kate, it's different. Different." The word echoed in Ron's mind, hollow and cruel. It felt like a slap, followed by a cold, sharp blade slicing through the remnants of the life he thought he knew. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, was standing in front of him, admitting that their love, his love, was no longer enough. Ron's jaw clenched as he fought the urge to lash out, to scream, to demand answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The air around him felt suffocating, the walls of the restaurant closing in. He needed to leave, to get as far away from this scene as possible before the pain became unbearable. "Different," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. 12 years, Tracy, 12 years, and now I'm just not enough?" "It's not like that," Tracy said desperately, her hands reaching out as if to hold on to him, to stop him from slipping away. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "But it did," Ron said, stepping back from her touch. "You let it happen." The finality in his tone seemed to drain the fight from Tracy. She lowered her arms, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. Ron turned his gaze to Kate, who flinched under his piercing stare. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "How long?" Kate hesitated, glancing at Tracy for guidance, but Tracy remained silent, her head bowed. Finally, Kate muttered, "A few months." Ron nodded slowly, the confirmation both a relief and a fresh wound. He had suspected something was wrong for weeks. Tracy's late nights, her distracted smiles, the way she pulled away when he tried to hold her. But hearing it out loud, knowing the truth, didn't make it hurt any less. Without another word, Ron turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the noise of the restaurant. Each step felt heavier than the last, his heart breaking with every inch he put between himself and the woman he had vowed to love, for better or worse. As he stepped out into the cold night air, the full weight of what had just happened hit him like a tidal wave. His breath hitched, his vision blurred, and for the first time in years, Ron Harding allowed himself to cry. But even through the tears, one thought burned brightly in his mind. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Ron stared at Tracy, her words hanging in the air like a cruel joke. Figure things out? He felt his chest tighten, his pulse quickening as her plea replayed in his mind. After everything, after months of deceit and betrayal, she wanted time? The audacity was staggering. He let out a bitter laugh, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Time?" he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "You didn't ask for time when you started sneaking around with her, did you?" "No, Tracy, you made your choice, and it sure as hell wasn't me." Tracy flinched as if he had struck her, but Ron didn't care anymore. Whatever sympathy he might have had for her was buried under an avalanche of anger and pain. She opened her mouth to speak, but he silenced her with a raised hand. "Don't," he said sharply, his voice firm. "Don't insult me with excuses. I don't need to hear them." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the clinking of glasses and murmured conversations fading into the background. Kate looked uncomfortable, her gaze darting between Ron and Tracy as if searching for an escape. Tracy, on the other hand, looked desperate, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a penitent sinner begging for absolution. "Ron, please," she said, her voice cracking. "It's not that simple." Ron scoffed, the sound harsh and cutting. It is that simple. You broke our vows. You lied to me, to us. And now you want me to just wait while you figure things out? I'm not some backup plan, Tracy. I'm your husband, or at least I was. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on him, their whispers like a low hum in the back of his mind, but he didn't care. Let them watch. Let them judge. He was done being the silent, understanding husband. He was done being humiliated. Tracy's expression shifted, a flicker of defiance flashing in her eyes. It's not fair to say I chose her over you. I've been confused. Confused? Ron interrupted, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. Confusion doesn't lead to secret dinners in candlelit restaurants. Confusion doesn't lead to holding hands across the table while your husband sits at home wondering why you're so distant. Tracy's face reddened, but Ron didn't stop. The dam had broken, and everything he had been holding back came rushing out. You've been sneaking around behind my back building a new life with her, while I've been standing here like a fool, trying to fix a marriage that was already over in your mind. Well, congratulations, Tracy. You don't have to figure anything out, because I've figured it out for you. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. Tracy called after him, her voice frantic and pleading, but he didn't stop. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, the chaos of the restaurant giving way to the relative quiet of the city streets. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his shaking hands and calm the storm raging inside him. Back at the house, Ron sat in the darkened living room, the glow from a nearby lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He stared at the framed photos on the mantel, snapshots of a life he thought was solid, a love he believed was unshakable. There they were, smiling on their honeymoon, laughing during a holiday ski trip, holding hands at their 10th anniversary party, and last, all of it felt like lies now. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before he dialed. The line rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. James Preston's office, the voice said. How may I help you? This is Ron Harding, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. I need to speak with Mr. Preston. It's urgent. Of course, Mr. Harding. One moment, please. The hold music was a dull drone in his ear, but it gave him a moment to collect himself. When James Preston, his lawyer of many years, finally picked up, Ron didn't waste time. James, I need to file for divorce, he said bluntly. Effective immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for Ron to imagine the slight raise of James's eyebrows. I'm sorry to hear that, Ron, James said carefully. Do you want to discuss this in person? We can... No, Ron interrupted. I don't want to talk about it. I just need this done. Tonight, if possible. All right, James replied, his tone shifting to business-like efficiency. I'll need some details, of course. Are you looking to serve her privately or at work? Ron said, the words falling out of his mouth before he could second-guess them. I want her served at work. She needs to know I'm serious about this. Another pause, then a quiet sigh. Understood. I'll draft the papers tonight and send them for your review. But Ron, if I may, Are you sure you don't want to take some time to think this through? Ron clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the phone. I've had enough time to think, James. This isn't a decision I'm making lightly. Just get it done. The next morning, Ron sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers James had emailed him overnight. His coffee sat untouched beside him, the steam curling upward in lazy tendrils. The words on the screen blurred as he read them for the third time, each line hammering home the finality of what he was about to do. Serve her at work, he muttered to himself, his own voice sounding foreign in the empty house. It wasn't about revenge, he told himself. It was about making a statement. Tracy needed to understand that her actions had consequences, that she couldn't string him along while she indulged in her so-called confusion. As he hit send, authorizing James to proceed, a strange calm settled over him. The storm inside him hadn't passed, but it had quieted, replaced by a cold determination. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that restaurant the night before. That man had been naive, hopeful, blind to the cracks in his marriage. This man, this new version of Ron, was done hoping, done waiting, done being second to anyone. The moment the papers were served at Tracy's office, Ron's phone began ringing incessantly. Her name flashed on the screen again and again, accompanied by an almost desperate rhythm of vibrating notifications. He ignored the calls at first, letting them roll to voicemail, but when she showed no signs of stopping, he picked up. "Ron, how dare you?" Tracy's voice came through sharp and furious, a stark contrast to the pleading tone she had used at the restaurant. "You humiliated me, at work of all places." Ron leaned back in his chair, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. "Humiliated you?" he replied, his voice cold and steady. "You're mad about being served papers after what you did? You humiliated me, Tracy, in front of everyone. At least this was private." "It's not the same," she snapped, her indignation flaring. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Ron interrupted, cutting her off with a calmness that belied the storm inside him. "You're upset because now everyone knows the truth. Your perfect little life is falling apart, and you can't handle it." There was a pause on the line and, for a brief moment, Ron thought she might apologize, might show some semblance of remorse. Instead, Tracy's voice came back softer, but still laced with anger. "Ron, this isn't who I am. I'm still figuring things out. Can't you see that?" Ron's grip on the phone tightened. "You don't get to figure things out at my expense, Tracy. You made your choice the moment you decided to betray me. Stop calling me unless it's about the divorce." He hung up before she could respond, tossing his phone onto the table with a frustrated sigh, but Tracy's words lingered in his mind, like a thorn he couldn't quite pull free. She wasn't done with him, and he knew it. The fallout from the divorce papers spread quickly. Mutual friends and family, once a tight-knit circle, began to splinter into factions. Some supported Ron, their outrage mirroring his own, while others rushed to defend Tracy, citing her struggle with figuring out her sexuality as an excuse for her actions. "She's just trying to understand who she is," one friend had said during an awkward lunch. "Don't you think you should give her some grace?" Ron had nearly choked on his coffee. "Grace? She didn't give me any grace when she started sneaking around. Why should I extend her that courtesy now?" His frustration only grew as the weeks passed. Everywhere he turned, someone seemed ready to excuse Tracy's betrayal, as if her newfound identity somehow absolved her of the pain she had caused him. Family gatherings became battlegrounds, with Ron's parents fiercely defending him, while his sister urged him to reconsider, insisting that Tracy's actions weren't entirely her fault. "People make mistakes, Ron," she had said during one particularly heated argument. "And she's clearly going through something." "Yeah, she is," Ron had replied, his voice sharp, and she can go through it without me. Tracy's attempts to reconcile only added fuel to the fire. She showed up unannounced at his house one evening, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling as she clutched a stack of letters she claimed to have written for him. "Ron, please," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped into the doorway. "I just want to talk." "You've done enough talking," Ron replied, blocking her from coming any further. "And frankly, I've heard all I need to hear." "But I love you," Tracy said, her voice desperate. "What we had, it meant something. It still means something." Ron's jaw tightened, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Love doesn't look like betrayal, Tracy. It doesn't look like you sneaking around and then asking me to wait while you decide if I'm good enough for you. You don't love me. You love the safety I gave you while you figured out what you really wanted." Tracy's face crumpled, her tears falling freely now. "I made a mistake, Ron. I'm trying to make it right." "It's too late for that," Ron said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "You didn't just make a mistake, Tracy. You made a choice. And now, I'm making mine." He closed the door, the sound of her sobs muffled as he leaned against it, his breath coming in shaky gasps. Every fiber of his being wanted to crumble, to let her back in and pretend this nightmare hadn't happened. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. Not this time. As the divorce proceedings progressed, Ron found himself facing an onslaught of emotional appeals, not just from Tracy, but from the people around him. Her family reached out, begging him to reconsider. Friends who once seemed loyal began to question his resolve, their sympathy for Tracy clouding their judgment. "You're being too harsh," one friend had said during a tense phone call. "She's clearly struggling. Can't you at least meet her halfway?" Ron's patience snapped. "Struggling doesn't give her the right to destroy our marriage," he said, his voice sharp. "Why is it my responsibility to clean up the mess she made? She chose this path, not me." Despite the societal pressure, Ron remained steadfast. He threw himself into his work, finding solace in the structure and predictability of his daily routine. But even there, the whispers followed him. Colleagues exchanged sympathetic glances, their murmured conversations stopping abruptly when he entered the room. He ignored them, focusing instead on rebuilding the life Tracy had shattered. Meanwhile, Tracy's public image began to falter. The humiliation of being served at work had made her the subject of office gossip, and her attempts to defend herself only seemed to dig her deeper into the hole. Word of her affair with Kate spread quickly, and while some colleagues expressed support, others weren't so forgiving. Ron heard about it all secondhand, snippets of conversations filtering back to him through mutual acquaintances. He felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness, knowing that Tracy was facing the consequences of her actions, but wishing it hadn't come to this. Despite everything, he had never wanted to see her hurt. But that didn't mean he would let her back in. One evening, Ron received a final call from Tracy. Her voice was calmer this time, the anger replaced by a weary resignation. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything. I know I can't fix what I broke, but I needed you to know that." Ron listened in silence, his grip on the phone tightening. He wanted to believe her, to let her apology soften the edges of his pain, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it certainly didn't mean reconciliation. "Thank you for saying that," he said finally, his voice measured. "But Tracy, this doesn't change anything. I'm moving forward. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, I really do. But you won't find it here." When the call ended, Ron felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. Tracy was no longer his problem. Her choices were hers to live with, just as his were his to own. And as he sat in the quiet of his home, the pieces of his broken life slowly coming together, Ron realized something. He wasn't just surviving this storm. He was rebuilding, one step at a time. Ron had never felt more out of place in his own life. The bright decorations of the birthday party mocked him with their cheerfulness, every streamer and balloon a cruel reminder of the fractured family they were pretending to be. His daughter, Sophie, squealed with delight as she tore through the wrapping on her gifts, her joy a small solace amidst the chaos. Yet even that couldn't dull the sharp edge of Tracy and Kate's presence. They stood together, a little too close, sharing quiet smiles and whispered words. Kate handed Sophie a box wrapped in pastel-colored paper, and Tracy crouched down beside her, beaming as their daughter unveiled an expensive doll. The image burned into Ron's mind, fueling the bitter resentment that had been festering since the day his world unraveled. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was their audacity. They had stolen his family, his peace, and now they had the gall to parade their happiness in front of him? As the service went on, Ron found himself lost in the quiet grief of it all. The soft murmurs of the preacher's words faded into the background as he focused on the image of Kate in his mind. Her smile, her presence in their lives, and how her death had left an unspoken void that he knew couldn't be filled. He had hoped that being here at the funeral would bring him some kind of peace, some sense of closure, but instead, all he felt was emptiness, a deep, gnawing emptiness that threatened to consume him whole. The wake that followed was no better. The house was filled with family and friends who whispered in hushed tones, offering their condolences, but Ron felt like a stranger among them. He didn't belong here. Not anymore. Tracy moved from group to group, speaking with her family and friends, while Ron lingered near the back, a silent observer to the grief that wasn't his to carry. At one point, Abby walked up to him, her eyes swollen from crying, but she stood by him without saying a word. He could see the hurt in her eyes, but there was something else there too, something softer. Understanding, maybe. Or maybe just acceptance. "You did what you thought was right, Dad," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "But you can't keep punishing yourself for it." Ron glanced at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his decisions. "I never wanted any of this," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." "I know," Abby whispered, "but sometimes we hurt people, even when we don't mean to. All we can do is move forward." He nodded slowly, the words sinking into him like a salve to a wound that hadn't healed yet. He didn't know if he would ever forgive himself for refusing to help Kate, for letting his anger cloud his judgment. But maybe, just maybe, he could learn to forgive himself enough to rebuild the bridges he had burned. As the evening wore on and people began to trickle out, Ron stood there in the fading light, his daughters by his side, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Not for Kate, not for Tracy, but for himself, for his daughters. The road ahead would be long, but it was one he was willing to face. Together, the funeral was over, and the mourners had begun to trickle out of the chapel, leaving Ron standing near the door, his heart heavy with everything that had transpired. Kate's absence lingered in the air like a wound that refused to heal. But it wasn't just her death that weighed on him. It was the rift he had created with his own flesh and blood, the distance he couldn't seem to bridge with his daughters. Abby was the first to approach him. She came silently, her eyes red from crying, but there was a softness to her now, an understanding he hadn't seen in weeks. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug, her small frame trembling slightly against his. For a moment, he just stood there, holding her, as if she were the anchor keeping him grounded. She pulled away, her eyes looking up at him with a mix of sadness and something else, a flicker of hope. I'm glad you came, Dad, Abby whispered, her voice full of quiet sincerity. It wasn't the forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was something. It was the first step toward healing, toward a future where they might start to rebuild the pieces of their broken family. But then there was Emma. She stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the floor. The anger was still there, thick and palpable, and Ron could feel the weight of her judgment in the silence between them. He took a step toward her, his heart pounding as he struggled to find the words that might break through the wall she had built around herself. "Emma," he said, gently, his voice rough from emotion, "I'm sorry." Her eyes flickered up to meet his, but the bitterness in her stare was still sharp. "You didn't even try," she said, her voice tight with hurt. "You could have helped her. You could have saved her. But you didn't even try." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He could feel the weight of her disappointment crashing down on him. She was right. He hadn't tried. He had let his anger and pain dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. Not just in the loss of Kate, but in the damage to his relationship with Emma. "I know," Ron replied, his voice hoarse. "I know I failed you. But I'll never stop trying to make things right." Emma didn't respond, and Ron could feel her turning away from him, retreating back into the cold distance that had taken root between them. It felt like a loss, and in many ways it was, but he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he still had a chance to fix this. Weeks passed, and the space between Ron and Emma didn't shrink. She continued to pull away, avoiding his calls and texts. At night, Ron would sit alone in his living room, his phone in hand, typing and deleting messages to her, unsure of what to say. He tried to keep it simple. He sent texts like, "I love you," and "I'm here when you're ready." Sometimes he'd type more, pouring his heart out into words that he never sent, too afraid of pushing her further away. But eventually, it worked. One night, the phone buzzed in his hand. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in weeks, his heart leapt. He stared at it for a long time before answering, unsure of what would come next. "Hi, Dad." Her voice came through, quiet but steady. "I've been thinking a lot." Ron swallowed, trying to steady his breath. "I'm glad you called, Emma. I've been thinking a lot too, about everything." I don't get it, Dad," she said, the words spilling out slowly. "I don't understand why you couldn't just do it, why you couldn't help her." Ron closed his eyes, his chest tight. I wish I could explain it to you in a way that would make sense," he said, his voice thick. "I was hurt. I was angry, and I was scared. But not helping Kate, not being there when she needed me, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm sorry. Emma was silent for a moment, and Ron could feel her grappling with her emotions, as confused and torn as he was. He held his breath, unsure of where this conversation was going. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand, Dad," Emma said quietly, the words hanging in the air. "But I'm trying to." Ron felt a wave of relief wash over him, not because the situation was resolved, but because she was trying to understand, trying to rebuild something that had been shattered. That was enough for now. They were silent for a few moments, and then Emma's voice came again, softer this time. "I don't want to be mad at you forever, Dad," she whispered. Ron's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The raw emotion in her voice, the vulnerability, it cut through him like a knife. He cleared his throat and finally said, I don't want that either, sweetheart. I don't want to lose you." There was a long pause before Emma spoke again, maybe we can start over, slowly. But I need time, and I need you to be patient. I'll wait, Ron said, his voice steady, the promise clear. I'll wait for as long as it takes. The conversation ended with a quiet click as Emma hung up, but Ron didn't feel the emptiness that had plagued him for so long. He felt something new, something fragile yet powerful. Hope. A few weeks later, they met at a small cafe, one of Emma's favorite spots from her childhood. She arrived early, sitting at a corner table with a mug of coffee in front of her, her hands wrapped around it for warmth. Ron sat down across from her, his heart pounding with anticipation. There was a distance still between them, but it was smaller now, and that was enough. They didn't speak immediately. Instead, they just sat there, drinking coffee in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice soft. "I'm glad we're talking," she said, her eyes meeting his. "It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start." Ron smiled, his heart swelling with a bittersweet sense of relief. It's a start. As they sat there sharing stories and slowly, hesitantly, reconnecting, Ron realized something deep inside him. Healing wasn't a straight path. There was no simple way to undo the damage, no magic words that could make everything right. But love? Love had a way of slowly mending the broken parts, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long while, Ron felt like he was on the right path again. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and pain, but it would also be filled with hope. And that was something he would cling to with everything he had. Ron forced a smile as Sophie rushed over to show him her new doll. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice softening as he knelt to her level. "Did you thank your mom? And Kate?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically before running off to play with her friends, leaving Ron to face the women who had upended his life. Tracy approached first, her expression a mix of caution and determination. "Ron," she said quietly, her tone measured, "I think it's important for us to stay civil. For the kids." Ron's jaw tightened. He had heard those words too many times, always delivered with the same patronizing tone, as if his anger was the real problem. He met her gaze, his eyes cold. "Civil?" he said, his voice low but cutting. "You don't get to walk away with everything and then ask me to play nice." Tracy's lips thinned into a tight line, her composure slipping. "This isn't about you or me," she snapped. "It's about Sophie and Lily. They deserve to have both their parents in their lives without this constant tension." Ron laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "The tension you created, Tracy. Don't stand there and act like I'm the one making this hard." Kate, who had been lingering nearby, stepped in. "Ron, I know you're hurt, but—" "You don't get to speak to me," Ron interrupted sharply, his gaze slicing through her like a blade. "You have no right. Not here, not ever." The party continued around them, the laughter and chatter of children and adults alike, a surreal backdrop to the confrontation. Ron could feel the stares of a few family members who were close enough to overhear, their discomfort palpable. He didn't care. Let them judge. Let them talk. He was done pretending. The boiling point came weeks later, delivered in the form of a late-night phone call. Ron had been sitting in his living room, the quiet hum of the television a soothing distraction, when his phone buzzed. Tracy's name lit up the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Ron," she began, her voice strained and uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's Kate. She's been diagnosed with leukemia." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he said nothing, his silence heavy on the line. Tracy took a shaky breath before continuing. "She needs a bone marrow transplant. The doctors think you might be a match." Ron's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching, as a wave of conflicting emotions crashed over him. Anger, resentment, pity, all of it churned in his chest, threatening to consume him. "And why," he said finally, his voice icy, "would I do that?" "For the girls," Tracy said, her voice breaking. "Ron, please, if something happens to Kate, they'll lose her. I'm begging you." He stood, pacing the room as his emotions threatened to boil over. "You want me to save the woman who helped destroy our marriage?" he asked incredulously. "The woman you threw our family away for?" "This isn't about us," Tracy said, desperation creeping into her voice. "It's about saving a life, about giving our daughters a chance to grow up with—" "Stop," Ron snapped, cutting her off. "Just stop. You don't get to use the girls as leverage. You don't get to paint me as the villain here." "Ron, please," Tracy pleaded, her voice cracking. "She's their stepmother. They love her." He laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Find someone else. I'm not doing it." "Ron." "No!" he roared, the word exploding from him with a force that left the room ringing with silence. "You don't get to ask this of me. You don't get to waltz back into my life, after everything, and demand I save her." The line went quiet, Tracy's soft sobs barely audible on the other end. Ron closed his eyes, running a hand through his hair, as his anger gave way to an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice softer but no less resolute. "I can't do it." The fallout was immediate and brutal. Tracy's desperation turned to outrage, her calls and messages growing increasingly accusatory. Family members who had once sympathized with Ron began to turn against him, their judgments sharp and unforgiving. "How can you let your pride stand in the way of saving someone's life?" his sister had asked during one particularly heated conversation. "What kind of example are you setting for your daughters?" Ron had no answer. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his refusal wasn't about pride, but self-preservation. He couldn't stomach the thought of being the one to save Kate, to extend her the mercy she had never shown him. But the words felt hollow, even to him. One night, as he sat alone in his kitchen, the weight of it all came crashing down. He stared at the unopened bottle of scotch on the counter, the temptation to numb the pain clawing at him. But instead of pouring a drink, he picked up his phone and opened the Photos app. There they were, Sophie and Lily, their smiles bright and unburdened in a series of candid snapshots. His daughters, his world. For the first time, doubt crept in, piercing through the wall of anger he had built around himself. Was he punishing the wrong person? Was his refusal to help Kate a betrayal of his love for his girls? He closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. The choice before him was no longer just about Kate or Tracy. It was about what kind of father he wanted to be, about the legacy he would leave for the two people who mattered most. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the kitchen window, Ron made a decision that would change everything. Ron sat in his living room, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. His daughters hadn't spoken to him for days. Sophie, still too young to fully understand the rift, clung to him with the innocent affection only a child could offer. But Emma and Abby, they had retreated into their own worlds, each of them carrying the fallout of his refusal like a personal wound. It was Emma who came to him first. The door to the living room creaked open, and her silhouette stood in the doorway, her face shadowed by the dim light of the hallway. Ron glanced up, his heart sinking at the sight of her. She wasn't just his daughter. She was the one who had always looked up to him, trusted him to be her protector, her father. And now, she looked at him with eyes full of anger and hurt. "Emma?" Ron began, trying to find the words, but she cut him off before he could continue. "You could have saved her," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "You could have helped Kate. You could have saved her life, but you didn't even try." The words hit Ron harder than he expected. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the pain in her voice, the disappointment that echoed in her every syllable. "I couldn't, Emma," he said, his voice hoarse. "I couldn't do it. I'm sorry, but I couldn't." Emma shook her head, stepping back, as if his words were a physical blow. "You're a coward," she whispered, turning away and walking out of the room. Ron didn't chase her. He couldn't. His heart was breaking, not just because of Kate's death, but because his daughter, his own flesh and blood, had lost faith in him. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and resignation. Abby, ever the more understanding of the two, continued to reach out, offering him small gestures of comfort, a cup of coffee in the morning, a text asking how he was feeling. But Ron could feel the distance between them growing, too. Abby had always been the quiet one, the one who observed rather than acted, but even she couldn't erase the growing divide between them. They sat in the kitchen together one evening, the tension in the air thick and unspoken. Ron glanced up at Abby, who had been silently watching him for a long time, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and sadness. "I don't understand, Dad," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I know why you said no to helping Kate, but I thought you'd be different. I thought you'd find a way to help, to do the right thing, even if it hurt." She looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. Ron opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words felt hollow. He couldn't undo what he had done. "I can't fix it," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "I can't fix what happened." "I know," Abby replied, her voice breaking as she finally met his eyes. "But that's what hurts, Dad. You didn't even try." The phone call came 2 days later, while Ron was standing in his backyard, staring at the empty swing where he used to push his daughters when they were younger. Tracy's name flashed on the screen, and he knew what was coming before he even answered. "Ron," Tracy said, her voice flat but heavy with grief. "Kate passed away this morning." Ron's breath caught in his throat, the sudden weight of the words hitting him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, feeling the sting of loss, not just for Kate, but for the rift it had caused in his family, for the daughters who would never have a chance to know the woman they had once been told to love. "I'm sorry," he said, though the words felt useless. "I didn't want this." Tracy was silent for a long moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I know you didn't, Ron," she said softly. "But now, you have to think about the girls. They need you. They need both of us." Ron felt a knot twist in his stomach. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell Tracy that he had done enough, that he had already given everything he could to this broken family. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with the weight of Kate's death hanging between them. "I'll be there," he said finally, his voice tight. "I'll go to the funeral. For the girls." The funeral was a quiet, somber affair. The cold November wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves as if nature itself were mourning. Tracy, Kate's parents, and a few close friends stood near the casket, their faces drawn and pale. Ron stood at the back, watching from a distance as his daughters stood by their mother, their small hands clasped together. Emma refused to meet his eyes. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Abby, on the other hand, gave him a slight nod of acknowledgement, but the distance between them was still palpable.